The sun was a hammer, and the land was the anvil. For 3 days, it had beaten down on Claire, flattening the hope out of her until all that remained was the thrumming in her head and the fire in her throat. The world had bleached itself to shades of bone and dust. Jagged rocks, their edges sharp as broken teeth, clawed at the hem of her dress, which was already in tatters, a testament to the scrub and thorns she had pushed through. Her feet, shod in shoes too big and worn too thin, were a geography of pain, mapped with blisters that had broken and bled and were now coated in a fine, gritty layer of reddish dirt. She hadn't seen another soul since she'd slipped away from the last settlement, a place that had offered no comfort, only the lingering stares of men whose eyes held a different kind of hunger. Now, that memory was a distant echo, drowned out by the singular, roaring need for water. Her mind had shrunk to that one word, water. It had been a prayer, then a demand, and now it was just a sound, a dry rasp in her mind with no meaning left to it. The creek bed was a cruel joke. From a distance, its winding path had promised life, a ribbon of silver in the haze. Up close, it was a grave. The sand was cracked into a mosaic of despair, and the stones that lined its banks were sun-baked and white. She stumbled onto them, her knees giving way with a finality that felt less like a choice and more like a cord being cut. She fell not with a cry, but with a soft, defeated sigh, her cheek pressing against the hot, rough surface of a large, flat rock. A lizard, startled from its sunning spot, skittered away into a fissure, its sudden movement the only sign of life in this desolate theater. Her consciousness began to fray at the edges. Images floated behind her closed eyelids, a glass of cool buttermilk sweating on a wooden table, the heavy scent of rain on dry soil, the face of her younger brother, his smile wide and innocent before. She pushed the thought away. It was too heavy to carry. Everything was too heavy. Even the weight of her own eyelids was an unbearable burden. The buzzing of a fly near her ear was the last sound she registered before the world dissolved into a shimmering, silent blackness. She didn't know how much time had passed, minutes or an hour, when a shadow fell over her. It was a cool, sudden interruption in the relentless blaze of the sun. It was so unexpected that for a moment, she thought it was a cloud, a fleeting mercy from the heavens. But the shadow was too sharp, too defined. With an effort that sent a jolt of agony through every muscle, she forced one eye open. The world swam back into a blurry, distorted view. She saw a horse first, a large roan with a coat the color of dried blood and dust. Its flank twitched, shaking off a fly. Then she saw the boots. They were old leather, scuffed at the toes and stained with the grime of a long trail, but solid, unyielding. Her gaze traveled slowly upward, past legs clad in denim worn pale at the knees, past a belt with a plain, unadorned buckle, to a man who sat atop the horse as if he'd been born in the saddle. He was tall, his frame lean but broad at the shoulders. A low-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, covered in a dark stubble, and the stillness of his posture. He wasn't looking at her with pity, or curiosity, or malice. He was simply looking. His eyes, from what she could discern in the shade, were dark and unreadable, like deep, still water. They took in her tattered dress, her bloody feet, her sprawled and broken form, and registered it all with a quiet, unnerving calm. He seemed a part of the landscape itself, weathered, silent, and enduring. Claire's heart gave a panicked flutter. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in the quiet of a creek bed, but at the hands of a stranger who had found her at her weakest. She tried to move, to curl into a ball, to make herself smaller, but her limbs refused to obey. A dry sob caught in her throat, a sound no louder than the rustle of a dead leaf. The man made no move to dismount. He just sat there, the horse shifting its weight beneath him, the creak of leather the only sound in the oppressive silence. He looked at her. Then his gaze swept the horizon. A slow, methodical scan, as if checking for something he already knew wasn't there. He was alone. They were alone. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Then he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He reached for a canteen hanging from his saddle horn. It was a dented metal thing, its surface dulled by the sun and trail. The sound of the clasp being unhooked was unnaturally loud in the stillness. He didn't swing down from the horse. He simply leaned over, his arm extending. He didn't try to hand it to her. He didn't speak a word. He just held it for a moment, then let it drop. It landed in the sand beside her hand with a soft thud. The sound was so gentle, so at odds with the violence of her fear, that it confused her. He straightened up in the saddle, gave the reins a barely perceptible nudge, and the roan turned, its hooves crunching softly on the gravelly earth. He rode away without a backward glance, his form growing smaller and smaller against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the plains until he was just a dark speck that eventually vanished into the heat shimmer. For a long time, Claire just lay there, her mind struggling to process what had happened. It felt like a dream, a feverish hallucination born of sun and thirst. But the canteen was real. It lay beside her, solid and cool against the baked earth. Slowly, painstakingly, she willed her hand to move. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the metal. It was cool to the touch, a miracle in this furnace of a world. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed herself up onto one elbow. The world spun violently, and black spots danced in her vision. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for it to pass. When she opened them again, the canteen was still there. It wasn't a mirage. Getting the cap off was a battle. Her hands were weak and clumsy, her fingers slick with sweat, but the desperation gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. Finally, the metal threads gave way with a faint squeak. She brought the opening to her lips, tilting it carefully. The first drop of water was a shock. It was warm from the sun, but it was life. It touched her cracked lips and burned like fire, then trickled into her mouth, over a tongue that felt like a swollen piece of wood. She swallowed, and the water seared a path down her raw, parched throat. It was agonizing, and it was the most wonderful sensation she had ever known. She didn't gulp it down. Some deep primal instinct for survival took over. She took small, measured sips, letting the water sit in her mouth before swallowing. Each swallow was a conscious act of pulling herself back from the brink. With each sip, the world seemed to come into sharper focus. The relentless ringing in her ears subsided. The hard edges of the rocks softened. The color began to bleed back into the bleached landscape. The sky was a deeper, more startling blue. The distant mesas were a richer, more profound purple. After a few minutes, she had drunk nearly half of the canteen's contents. She screwed the cap back on. Her movements still slow, but more certain now. She hugged the canteen to her chest, a precious, life-giving treasure. The fear that had paralyzed her was receding, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. But also something else, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. It was a fragile thing, as delicate as a wildflower pushing its way through cracked earth. A man had found her, helpless and alone, and had not harmed her. He had not taken anything from her. He had given her the one thing she needed to survive and had asked for nothing in return. He hadn't even waited for a word of thanks. He had simply acted and moved on, as much a force of nature as the wind and the sun. Claire sat up, leaning her back against the rock. She looked out at the empty expanse where he had disappeared. There was no sign of him, no dust cloud, no distant shape. It was as if he had never been there at all, except for the weight of the canteen in her lap and the life-giving moisture that was now coursing through her veins, pushing back the darkness, whispering to her that she had to keep going. She didn't know who he was, or where he had come from, or why he had chosen to show her this small, silent mercy. But as she took another slow, deliberate sip of the warm water, she knew one thing for certain. He had saved her life. The water from the stranger's canteen was a temporary reprieve, a borrowed piece of life. It had pulled Claire back from the edge. But the morning sun rose with the same unforgiving intensity, reminding her that survival was not a single act, but a relentless, forward motion. She had finished the last of the water at dawn, the metal canteen now feeling hollow and useless in her hands. Leaving it behind felt like abandoning a sacred relic, but she couldn't carry its empty weight. She placed it carefully on the rock where she had woken, a silent offering of thanks to the man who was now just a ghost on the horizon. She had no destination, no map to follow. The world was a vast, terrifying canvas of rock and sky. But there was a direction. The direction the man had ridden. It wasn't a conscious decision to follow him. Not at first. It was more like the instinct of a lone animal drawn to the scent of a distant water hole. He was the only sign of life, the only proof that kindness could exist in this wasteland. And so, she walked, putting one aching foot in front of the other, her gaze fixed on the shimmering line where the earth met the sky. For hours, the landscape remained unchanged. The sun climbed, and the shadows shrank. Her renewed strength began to fray, the familiar despair coiling in her stomach. Hunger was a dull, constant ache. Her thoughts grew thin and scattered. Just as she was beginning to believe the man had been a hallucination after all, she saw it, a faint, almost transparent wisp of smoke rising in the distance, a fragile gray thread stitching the brown hills to the blue sky. Life. The sight sent a jolt through her, a current of pure, unreasoning hope. She quickened her pace, ignoring the sharp protest of her blistered feet. The smoke was a beacon. It grew thicker as she drew closer, and soon she could make out the dark, solid shapes at its source. It was a homestead, tucked into a protective curve of low, rolling hills that broke the monotony of the plains. It was small, stark, and solitary. A cabin, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, stood beside a small, sturdy-looking barn. A corral, its fence posts straight and evenly spaced, held a single horse the same roan she had seen yesterday. It was his. Claire stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She sank down behind a cluster of sun-bleached sagebrush, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The homestead was a fortress of solitude. There were no signs of a family, no children's toys scattered in the yard, no clothesline strung between trees. There was just the cabin, the barn, and the man. She watched him for a long time. He moved with a purpose that was both efficient and weary. He split firewood with a steady, rhythmic swing of the axe, the clean thwack of the steel echoing in the quiet air. He mended a loose rail on the corral fence, his movements precise and economical. There was nothing hurried about him, nothing wasted. He worked like a man who had nothing but time and no one to spend it on, but the endless cycle of tasks that kept loneliness at bay. What was she to do? Walk up to his door and ask for more? The thought filled her with a hot, creeping shame. He had given her water, a gesture that had cost him little but had meant everything to her. He had ridden away. That was the end of it. To appear at his home felt like a trespass, a demand for something more than he had offered. She was a stray, and she knew the fate of strays. Most were chased off with a harsh word or a well-aimed rock. She stayed hidden, watching as the sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent. The sky, which had been a flawless, piercing blue all day, began to change. To the west, the horizon darkened, turning the color of a deep bruise. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath, began to gust, whipping her hair across her face and carrying the distinct, earthy smell of rain. The air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The first drop of rain was fat and cold, landing on her dusty cheek with a small, startling splat. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the sky opened up. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a deluge. a solid sheet of gray water that blurred the landscape and turned the dust to instant mud. The temperature plummeted. Claire, her thin dress already soaked through, began to shiver violently. The storm made her decision, for she couldn't stay out here. She would be overcome by the cold long before the rain stopped. Scrambling to her feet, she ran, her awkward gait made worse by her oversized shoes sloshing with mud and water. The open ground between her hiding place and the homestead felt like a vast, exposed battlefield. The rain hammered down on her, plastering her hair to her scalp and blinding her. She didn't aim for the cabin. The thought of knocking on his door, of facing him in the intimacy of his home, was too much. Instead, she stumbled toward the barn. Its wide, open doors offered a dark, gaping promise of shelter. As she reached it, she saw him inside, leading the roan horse into a stall. He had been caught in the downpour too, his shirt dark with rain and clinging to his broad shoulders. She stood at the threshold, water streaming from her hair and the hem of her dress, forming a puddle at her feet. She was a drowned, pathetic creature, and she couldn't find her voice. The sound of the rain on the barn's wooden roof was a deafening roar, filling the space between them. He turned, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly, free from the shadow of his hat, which he now held in his hand. His features were stark, carved by sun and hardship. High cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth that was a firm, unsmiling line. His eyes were the same as she remembered, dark, steady, and impossible to read. They registered her presence without a flicker of surprise, as if he had been expecting her, or as if nothing in the world could surprise him anymore. He just looked at her, his expression giving nothing away. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Claire shivered, a tremor that racked her entire body, from cold and from fear. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold herself together. She had to say something. She had to ask. Her lips parted, but the word came out as a broken, hoarse whisper. "Please." It was all she could manage. It was everything. He didn't answer with words. His gaze held hers for a moment longer, then shifted, moving to a dry, empty stall in the corner. The stall was filled with a deep pile of clean, golden hay that smelled of sun and sweet grass. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod in its direction. That was all. It was permission. It was shelter. A wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak washed over Claire. She murmured a thank you, her voice still a fragile rasp, and moved past him, careful not to brush against him. She felt his eyes on her as she crossed the earthen floor and sank into the soft, welcoming hay. It was rough against her skin, but it was dry and warm, a luxury beyond imagining. She curled into a tight ball, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to stop the violent shivering. For a long time, the only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the soft snuffling of the horse in its stall. He didn't approach her. He moved to the other side of the barn and began to work, his motions unhurried. He took a dry cloth and began rubbing down the horse, his hands moving with a firm, practiced gentleness. Then he began to tend to his tack, his fingers methodically checking straps and buckles, his focus absolute. Claire watched him through the haze of her exhaustion. The simple, repetitive nature of his tasks was calming. He was a man who found his purpose in work, in the tangible reality of leather and wood and animal. It was a language she understood. She had been raised on a farm where the rhythm of the day was dictated by the needs of the land, not the whims of men. "Wyatt," he said. The sound of his voice startled her. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. He hadn't looked up from his work. He was speaking to the saddle strap he was mending. It took her a moment to realize he was offering his name. "Claire," she replied, her own voice a little stronger now. And then, silence again. But it was a different kind of silence. They had names now. They were no longer a stranger and a stray. but Wyatt and Claire, two people sharing a small, dry space while a storm raged outside. He never asked her where she came from. He never asked her what she was running from. He never asked who had given her the ugly bruise that was beginning to blossom on her cheekbone, a detail he had surely noticed but chosen to ignore. And she didn't ask him why he lived alone in a place so far from everything, or what had carved the deep lines of sorrow around his eyes, or why he spoke as if every word was a painful effort. The questions were ghosts in the barn, hovering in the space between them, but they both instinctively knew not to give them voice. The past was a dangerous country, a place full of traps and shadows. To speak of it was to invite it into the present, and this small shelter was too fragile to bear its weight. As the afternoon wore on and the storm settled into a steady, drumming rhythm, a strange sense of peace settled over Claire, tucked into the warm hay, listening to the rain and the quiet sounds of Wyatt working. She felt a measure of safety she hadn't known in months. It was a stark and silent safety, devoid of comfort or gentle words, but it was real. She could feel the deep, unspoken pain that radiated from him, a loneliness as vast and profound as the landscape outside. It was a hurt she recognized, for it mirrored the one she carried in her own heart. He was a man with his own ghosts, and in some unspoken way, that made him safe. He would not judge hers. The rain passed as it had come, with a sudden, final sigh. The morning broke across a world washed clean, the air sharp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and sage. From her nest in the hay, Claire watched the first pale fingers of dawn creep through the cracks in the barn walls. The shivering had long since stopped, replaced by a deep, aching weariness that was almost a comfort. She had slept, a true, dreamless sleep, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. When she emerged from the barn, the homestead was already awake. Wyatt was standing by the corral, mending a leather strap, his back to her. The roan horse watched him with a placid, trusting eye. The smoke she had seen yesterday was rising again, but this time it was from the stone chimney of the cabin, a thin, steady plume that spoke of a fire lit against the morning chill. The world felt quiet, ordered, and calm, and she was an intruder in it. The shame from yesterday returned, a dull, familiar ache. She was a burden, a mouth to feed, a body to shelter. She had offered nothing, given nothing. In the world she came from, that was a debt that could not be left unpaid. Pride, or perhaps just a desperate need to feel useful, propelled her forward. She would not be a charity case. She would earn her keep. Her first steps were a trial. The oversized men's shoes, which had been a misery when dry, were now a torture. The leather was stiff and cold from the damp, and the mud had worked its way inside, creating a gritty paste that chafed her raw skin. Each step was a carefully negotiated truce, with pain. She set her jaw and walked toward the woodpile near the side of the cabin, trying to make her limp as unnoticeable as possible. The cabin door was ajar. Peeking inside, she saw that a fire was indeed going in the hearth, but it was a small, sulking thing, more smoke than flame. The main room was sparse and impeccably neat. A narrow bed, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, a few shelves holding tins and sacks. It was a room stripped of all but the essentials, a space that held the echo of a profound and abiding loneliness. Wyatt had left a stack of kindling and smaller logs by the hearth. Claire knew her way around a fire. She knelt, ignoring the sharp protest of her feet, and set to work. She rearranged the logs, her small, deft hands creating a space for air to breathe. She added the dry kindling, coaxing the embers back to life. Soon, a steady, cheerful flame was licking at the wood, casting a warm, dancing light across the log walls. It was a small thing, but it was something. She had brought a little more warmth into his world. When Wyatt entered the cabin a few minutes later, he stopped just inside the doorway. He carried a bucket of milk, its surface frothing. His gaze went from the now roaring fire to Claire, who was still kneeling on the hearth, her hands outstretched to the warmth. He said nothing. His face remained a mask of stoic neutrality. But he walked over to the fire and held his own hands out, his big, calloused fingers absorbing the heat. It was an acknowledgement, a silent acceptance of her contribution. He gestured to the table. He set out 2 tin plates, a loaf of dark, heavy bread, and a wedge of cheese. He poured milk into 2 cups. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of a knife against the wooden board as he sliced the bread. The food was simple, but to Claire, it was a feast. It filled the gnawing emptiness in her belly and chased away the last of the chill from the night. After they ate, she knew what she had to do next. The water barrels by the cabin door were low. The trip to the creek a different, flowing creek. Not the dry bed where he'd found her was a short one, but it was a walk she was dreading. She found the wooden yoke in the barn, its surface worn smooth by years of use. She picked up the 2 empty buckets and started out. The shoes were her enemy. With every step, her feet slid inside the cavernous leather, her heels rubbing raw against the stiff, unforgiving backs. The blisters that had formed 2 days ago were now open sores, and the gritty mud inside the shoes was like sandpaper on her wounds. She could feel the damp stickiness of fresh blood seeping through the thin fabric of her stockings. The pain was a sharp, grinding thing, a constant, unwanted companion. She focused on the horizon, on the line of willows that marked the creek, and forced herself to put 1 foot in front of the other. Wyatt was at the corral, currying the roan. He didn't look up as she passed, but she felt his eyes on her. She knew he saw her hitching. Careful walk. She knew he saw the way her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides, but he kept his silence, and she was grateful for it. Pity would have been unbearable. His quiet, non-judgmental presence was a strange kind of mercy. Filling the buckets was the easy part. The water was cold and clear, a welcome balm on her dusty, overheated skin. Carrying them back was a different story. The yoke settled across her shoulders, its weight driving her deeper into the pain of her feet. The water sloshed, threatening to unbalance her. She walked slowly, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her, her entire being focused on the single, monumental task of reaching the cabin without falling. She made 2 more trips, her world shrinking to the well-worn path between the cabin and the creek. By the time the barrels were full, sweat was trickling down her temples, and her vision was blurry with unshed tears of pain and exertion. She leaned against the cabin wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and discreetly slipped 1 foot out of its prison. The stocking was stained a dark, ugly crimson. Later that afternoon, she saw him working on a section of fence that had been damaged by a rock slide from the hills. He had the posts set, but he was struggling to hold a new rail in place while hammering the spikes. Without a word, Claire walked over. She didn't offer help. She simply took hold of the heavy wooden rail, positioning it against the posts and holding it steady. Her arms ached with the strain, but she held on, her jaw tight with concentration. Wyatt glanced at her, a quick, unreadable look. Then he turned his attention back to his work, his hammer rising and falling with a powerful, efficient rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. The sounds echoed in the quiet valley. They worked like that for over an hour, a silent, synchronized team. He would position the rails, and she would hold them. He never spoke a word of instruction, and she never asked a question. They seemed to understand each other through the shared language of labor. But all the while, he saw the way she shifted her weight from 1 foot to the other. He saw the way she bit her lip whenever she had to take more than a few steps. When she knelt to pick up a dropped spike, he saw the faint but unmistakable smear of blood she left on a pale, flat stone. That evening, they ate again in silence. The fire crackled. The wind whispered around the corners of the cabin. Claire was so exhausted she could barely lift her cup to her lips. The pain in her feet had subsided into a dull, throbbing drumbeat. After the meal, she washed the plates in a basin of water, her movements slow and deliberate. She nodded a silent good night to Wyatt, who was sitting by the fire, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, and retreated to the barn. In the familiar comfort of the hay, she finally allowed herself to inspect the damage. She peeled off the damp, stiff shoes and the ruined stockings. Her feet were a mess, a raw and angry landscape of broken blisters and deep, chafed wounds. She had nothing to clean them with, nothing to bind them. All she could do was curl up in the hay, elevate her feet on a small pile, and pray that the night would bring some measure of healing. She awoke to the soft gray light of another dawn. The pain in her feet was a stiff, sharp reminder of yesterday's labors. For a moment, she considered staying in the barn, just for a little while, but the thought of Wyatt rising, working, and her doing nothing was more painful than the thought of walking. She forced herself to sit up, her muscles protesting. She dreaded putting on the shoes. They sat on the floor where she had left them, looking like two malevolent leather creatures. Taking a deep breath, she swung her legs over the side of her hay bale bed and stood up. She took a tentative step toward the cabin, wincing as her bare feet touched the cool, packed earth of the barn floor. She pushed open the heavy barn door and stepped outside. And then she saw them. Sitting on the small, flat stone that served as a doorstep to the cabin were a pair of boots. They weren't men's shoes. They were a woman's boots, small and sturdy. The leather was old, softened with age and oil, and a dark, rich brown. It was creased and scuffed in a way that spoke of long use, but it was also clean and cared for. The soles were worn smooth in places, but were still thick and solid. They were laced up to the ankle, practical and plain, with no feminine frills or adornments. They were boots made for walking, for working, for living in a land that did not suffer weakness gladly. Claire stopped dead, her heart giving a sudden, powerful lurch. She looked around. The homestead was still. Wyatt was nowhere in sight. The only movement was the roan horse, swishing its tail in the corral. Slowly, as if in a dream, she approached the doorstep. She knelt, her hands hovering over the boots for a moment before she dared to touch them. The leather was supple beneath her fingers. They looked about her size. With trembling hands, she picked one up. It was surprisingly light. She sat down on the stone step and, after a moment's hesitation, slid her bare foot inside. It was a perfect fit. The soft, worn leather enveloped her foot like a second skin. There was no pinching, no looseness. Her heels settled into a comfortable, worn hollow, and her toes had just enough room to move. It was a sensation so welcome, so profoundly right, that it brought a sharp, stinging heat to the back of her eyes. She quickly put on the other boot. It fit just as well. She stood up, taking a few tentative steps on the damp earth. There was no rubbing, no grinding, no pain. There was only the solid, secure feeling of her feet being properly held and protected. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She didn't sob or make a sound. She just stood there, the cool morning air on her face, letting the silent tears fall. It wasn't just about the boots. It was about the silence. It was about the observation. He had seen her need, a need she had been too proud to voice, and he had met it without a word, without expecting thanks, without making her feel diminished. It was the most profound act of kindness she had ever known. After a moment, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked toward the corral. Wyatt was there, his back still to her, tightening the cinch on his saddle. He had been there all along. He had been giving her this moment, allowing her to discover his gift in private. She walked toward him, her new steps steady and sure. The soft earth felt solid beneath her feet. He heard her approach and turned. His dark, unreadable eyes flickered down to the boots, then back up to her face. His expression didn't change. Claire opened her mouth to say thank you, but the words felt small and inadequate. They couldn't possibly contain the enormity of what she was feeling, so she closed it again. Wyatt simply gave a single, short nod. It was barely a movement, but it was enough. It said, I understand. It is done." And then he turned back to his horse. The matter closed. The silence between them settling back into its familiar, comfortable shape, now laced with a new and unspoken thread of trust. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. A pattern of shared, unspoken existence emerged, woven from the simple threads of survival. Claire would rise at dawn, coaxing the fire back to life in the cabin while Wyatt saw to the horse. She learned the specific creak of the floorboard that announced his return, the soft clink of the milk bucket being set down on the porch. He, in turn, seemed to learn the quiet sounds of her presence, the gentle scrape of the broom on the wooden floor, the soft hum she sometimes let escape when she was kneading dough for their daily bread. Life was stripped down to its essential elements: water from the creek, wood for the fire, food from his meager stores. Claire found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin where a garden had once been. The soil was hard and unforgiving, but she worked at it with a fierce determination. Using a rusty spade she'd found in the barn, she turned the earth, pulled the stubborn, sun-baked weeds, and felt a piece of her own broken spirit begin to mend with each clod of dirt she overturned. It was a wordless prayer, an act of faith in a future she couldn't yet see. Wyatt watched her. He never offered to help with the garden. It seemed to be a space she was claiming for herself. But one afternoon she came back from the creek to find a new, sturdy handle on the old spade, the wood smooth and freshly carved. Another time, a sack of seed potatoes, which must have been part of his own winter supply, was left sitting by the tilled earth. In her new boots, she felt grounded, capable. The pain in her feet had faded to a dull memory, replaced by the solid certainty of the earth beneath her soles. She could walk for miles, could carry the heavy water buckets without faltering, could stand for hours working the soil. The boots were a constant, silent reminder of his quiet perception, his wordless provision. The knot of fear that had lived in her stomach for so long had begun to loosen, its tight coils slowly unfurling in the vast, empty silence of the homestead. She was beginning to forget what it felt like to be constantly looking over her shoulder. The change came on a morning that started like any other. The sky was a high, cloudless blue, and the air was still and warm. Claire was by the creek, washing their few clothes on a flat, smooth rock, her hands chapped from the harsh lye soap. Wyatt was up on the gentle slope behind the cabin, reinforcing a section of the corral fence, the rhythmic, metallic ring of his hammer a familiar and comforting sound. It was the silence that she noticed first. The hammering stopped, not a pause, but a dead, sudden stop, as if the hand holding the hammer had been frozen in mid-swing. The air, which had been filled with the peaceful sounds of work, was suddenly empty, holding a new and terrible stillness. Claire's head snapped up. She looked toward the corral. Wyatt was standing perfectly still, a statue carved against the blue sky. He wasn't looking at the fence. He wasn't looking at her. His entire being was focused on something far away, on the high, dusty ridge that bordered the northern edge of his land. She followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar line of brown earth and bleached rock. Then she saw it, a thin, almost invisible plume of smoke, as faint as a strand of gray thread. It wasn't the thick, churning smoke of a wildfire. It was a lazy, deliberate smoke, the kind that came from a small, tended campfire. It was in the wrong place. No one ever came to that ridge. A cold dread, sharp and instantly familiar, pierced through the fragile peace she had built. The knot in her stomach snapped tight again, a cruel and painful clenching. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, what that smoke meant. They had found her. She scrambled to her feet, the wet shirt slipping from her numb fingers and falling into the creek. The water swirled it away, a flash of white against the brown stones. But she didn't notice. Her eyes were locked on Wyatt. He moved. His stillness broke, and he turned, his movements economical and swift. There was no panic in him, only a cold, compressed urgency. He looked directly at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than quiet sorrow in his eyes. She saw the glint of hard, dangerous knowledge. He didn't shout or call to her. He raised one hand and made a sharp, downward chopping motion. Get down. Get low. Then, he pointed decisively toward the cabin and jerked his head, a single, commanding gesture that needed no words. Move. Now. Claire didn't hesitate. The instinct for flight, dormant for these past few peaceful days, surged through her. She scrambled up the creek bank, her new boots finding purchase on the loose scree. She ran, staying low as he had indicated, her body bent, her breath coming in short. Sharp gasps. The world had narrowed to a single, terrifying point, the smoke on the ridge and the sanctuary of the cabin. By the time she reached it, he was already there, emerging from the dark doorway. He had shed his work apron and was now all lean, coiled tension. He held a long rifle in the crook of one arm, its wooden stock dark and oiled. In his other hand, he carried a water skin and a small, greasy leather pouch. The transformation was startling. The quiet homesteader was gone. In his place was a man who moved with the deadly, practiced grace of a hunter, or the hunted. He met her on the porch, his eyes sweeping over her, a quick, assessing glance. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't offer a single word of explanation. He didn't have to. The grim set of his jaw told her everything. He thrust the water skin and the leather pouch into her hands. The pouch was heavy, filled with what felt like bullets. "Stay behind me," he said. His voice was a low growl, stripped of all its previous roughness, now honed to a sharp, flat edge. He didn't lead her back the way she had come. He moved around the side of the cabin, away from the direct line of sight of the ridge. He walked with a light, almost soundless tread, his body seeming to melt into the shadows cast by the barn. Claire followed, her own footsteps sounding loud and clumsy in the sudden, suffocating silence. The air was thick, heavy, pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. Every rustle of a leaf, every chirp of a cricket sounded like a gunshot. He led her not toward the open plains, but back, up into the rugged, broken country of the hills behind the homestead. The terrain grew more difficult, a treacherous landscape of jagged rocks and thorny, grasping brush. It was a place where a man could twist an ankle with a single misstep, but Wyatt moved through it with a terrifying familiarity, his eyes constantly scanning not just the ridgeline, but the surrounding rocks, the shadows, the very air itself. He was reading the land, searching for signs that only he could understand. Claire struggled to keep up, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. The heavy pouch of bullets banged against her hip, but the boots held. They gave her traction on the loose rock and protected her ankles from the sharp stones. She focused on the back of Wyatt's shirt, on the steady, powerful movement of his shoulders, and she willed her legs to keep moving. After what felt like an hour of hard, silent climbing, he finally stopped. He pulled her down behind a towering outcrop of red rock that overlooked a deep, narrow ravine. It was a scar in the earth, a place of shadows and secrets. From here, they were completely concealed from the ridge, yet they could still see the thin plume of smoke, a sinister signal against the clear sky. "They'll come for the cabin," he said, his voice a low whisper that was almost swallowed by the wind. "They'll see the horse. They'll think we're holed up, waiting." He didn't ask who they were. He knew. His gaze flickered to her, and in that brief glance, she saw a stark, shared understanding. He knew she was running, and he knew that the people she was running from were not the kind to give up easily. But he wasn't just hiding. His mind was already working, moving ahead of the threat. His eyes scanned the ravine below them. "We need to pull them west," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Away from here, away from the trail south. Without another word, he began to move down into the ravine, a controlled slide down a steep, gravelly slope. He gestured for her to follow. The bottom of the ravine was a jumble of fallen rocks and dry, tangled undergrowth. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. He stopped at a spot where a thick carpet of dead, dry leaves had collected, blown in by seasons of wind. "Gather these," he commanded, his voice sharp with purpose. "And any dry grass you can find. Pile it there." He pointed to a small, sheltered alcove in the rock face, about 100 yards down the ravine, in a place that would be visible from the ridge but would obscure its source. Claire didn't ask why. She understood. They were going to build a fire of their own. A lie. They worked quickly, their movements frantic but efficient. They tore at the dry brush, scooped up armfuls of crisp, brown leaves. Their hands were scratched, their faces grimy with dirt and sweat. In minutes, they had a respectable pile of tinder-dry fuel. Wyatt then added a few greener branches to the top. "This'll make it smoke," he explained, his first real explanation for any of his actions. "Make it look like a real camp." He knelt beside the pile, pulling a small flint and steel from his pocket. He struck them together, once, twice, a third time. A tiny spark leapt into the small nest of dry grass he had prepared. He blew on it gently, his head bent, his focus absolute. A tiny tendril of smoke curled upwards. Then a small, hungry flame licked at the leaves. The fire caught, crackling to life. He let it burn for a minute. Then he began to smother it with the greener leaves. A thick, choking cloud of white smoke billowed upwards, carried by the breeze out of the ravine and into the open sky. From the ridge, it would look like a second campfire, one that had been hastily started and was now being tended. It was a clear signal, an invitation, and a deception. Wyatt grabbed her arm and pulled her back, deeper into the shadows of the rock outcrop where they had first hidden. "We wait," he breathed, his eyes fixed on their false signal. And as they crouched there, hidden in the cool darkness, the smell of their false smoke filling the air, a profound and chilling realization washed over Claire. She looked at Wyatt, at the rifle resting comfortably in his arms, at the hard, knowing look in his eyes, at the calm, methodical way he had anticipated their pursuers' moves and laid a trap of his own. This was not new to him. The flight, the deception, the cold, calculating assessment of danger, it was a language he spoke fluently. The solitude of his homestead was not just a preference. It was a necessity. The silence was not just a habit. It was a shield. The man who had given her water, who had left a pair of boots on his doorstep, was not just a quiet rancher with a sorrowful past. He was a man who knew, intimately, what it meant to run. He knew what it was like to live a life looking over his shoulder. In that moment, crouched in the dirt beside him, she understood that the thing she was running from, he had been running from it his whole life. They were not so different after all. The waiting was a new kind of torment, crouched in the sliver of shade offered by the rock. Claire felt every muscle in her body scream with a tension that was both old and new. The fear of being caught was a familiar poison, but this shared, silent, calculated waiting was different. It was active. It was a hunt in reverse. Wyatt was as still as the stone he leaned against, the long rifle resting across his knees not as a weapon, but as a natural extension of his body. His focus was absolute, his gaze fixed on the point where their false smoke trickled into the vast, indifferent sky. He wasn't just looking. He was listening with his entire being, his head cocked slightly, as if he could hear the whisper of hoofbeats on the wind from miles away. Time stretched and thinned, becoming a meaningless concept. The sun beat down, and the rocks around them radiated a dry, suffocating heat. Claire's throat was a desert, and the water in the skin he had given her felt more precious than gold. She took a small sip, the warm, leathery taste a shock, but a welcome one. Wyatt didn't move. Then he stiffened. It was a change so subtle she might have missed it if her attention hadn't been so completely fixed on him. A slight narrowing of his eyes, a tightening of the muscles along his jaw. He had seen something. Claire followed his gaze back to the distant ridge. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, 3 dark specks appeared, tiny figures on horseback, silhouetted against the sky. They paused, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The figures moved. Not toward the cabin. They turned, their direction shifting, and began to descend from the ridge, heading west, toward the deceptive plume of smoke rising from the ravine. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips in a ragged, silent rush. The decoy had worked. They had taken the bait. Wyatt didn't relax. He watched until the riders had disappeared into the broken country, their forms swallowed by the dips and folds of the land. Only then did he shift his weight, the quiet scrape of his boot on the gravel sounding like an explosion in the stillness. "They'll spend the rest of the day tracking that smoke," he said, his voice a low rumble. "When they find nothing, they'll be angry. They might circle back. We don't stay here." He stood, his movements fluid and sure, and started climbing again, deeper into the hills. The brief flicker of relief Claire had felt was extinguished, replaced by the cold reality of their situation. This wasn't over. It was just a temporary reprieve, a single battle won in a war she was still losing. They moved for another hour, the sun beginning its long descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. Wyatt led her to a place that seemed impossible to find, a narrow fissure in a wall of rock, almost completely obscured by a thick growth of gnarled, ancient junipers. Inside, the rock opened into a small, shallow cave, no bigger than a large closet, but it was sheltered, hidden, and defensible. The floor was covered in a soft, thick layer of sand, and the air inside was cool and still. "We'll spend the night here," he said. He set his rifle down with a quiet reverence and shrugged a small pack from his shoulders she hadn't even noticed he was wearing. As dusk settled, bleeding the color from the landscape and leaving behind a world of silver and shadow, Wyatt built a fire. He didn't build it at the mouth of the cave, where its light could be seen. He built it in a deep, natural depression in the rock floor, a sort of stone bowl, so that its flames were contained, their light thrown upwards against the cave's ceiling but invisible from the outside. He used dry, dead wood that he seemed to find by instinct in the gathering gloom, wood that would burn hot and clean with a minimum of smoke. Claire watched him, her earlier realization solidifying into a hard, undeniable truth. This was his world, this landscape of rock and shadow, of flight and concealment, was as familiar to him as the neat, sparse cabin was. The homestead wasn't his life, it was his hideout. He took 2 pieces of dried jerky from his pack and handed one to her. He also produced a handful of hardtack biscuits, giving her half. They ate in their customary silence. The only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of a coyote far off in the darkness. The food was tough and tasteless, but it was sustenance. It was life. The fire cast a warm, flickering glow on the rough-hewn walls of their temporary home. Outside, the vast, star-dusted darkness of the high desert was absolute. Here, in this small circle of light, the world felt contained, manageable. The immensity of her fear and loneliness seemed, for the first time, to have found a boundary. Wyatt sat across the small fire from her, cleaning his rifle with a small, oil-stained cloth. His movements were methodical, his focus intense. He was a man who took care of his tools, especially the one that stood between him and whatever ghosts pursued him. His face, illuminated by the dancing flames, was a study in contradictions. The harsh lines and weathered skin spoke of a brutal life, but the set of his mouth held a deep, profound sadness. His eyes, when they occasionally lifted from his work to scan the darkness beyond the cave, were filled with a weariness that seemed as old as the rocks around them. He had saved her. Not once, but twice now. He had given her water, then shelter, then boots. Today, he had put himself directly between her and the men who were hunting her. He had risked his home, his safety, his life, for a woman he didn't know. A stray he had found broken in a dry creek bed. And he had never asked for a thing in return. The question had been building in her all day, a pressure behind her breastbone. In her world, nothing was ever given freely. Every act of kindness was a transaction, a down payment on a debt that would one day be collected. Men who offered help to a woman alone, always, eventually, revealed what they wanted. Their charity was just a key to a different kind of cage. She looked at Wyatt, at his quiet self-sufficiency, at the deep well of sorrow in his eyes, and she couldn't reconcile him with the men she had known. But the fear, the ingrained suspicion, was still there. She had to know. She had to understand. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, small and fragile against the crackling of the flames. "What do you want from me?" Wyatt's hands stopped their steady work. He didn't look up immediately. He slowly, deliberately, finished wiping down the rifle's barrel, his movements as calm and unhurried as ever. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled only by the fire's hungry hiss. Claire's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. She had made a mistake. She had broken the unspoken rule, crossed a line into the territory of the past, of questions and demands. Finally, he set the rifle aside and lifted his head. His dark eyes met hers across the flames. There was no anger in them, no surprise. There was only a profound, bottomless exhaustion, as if he had been asked this question 1,000 times before, perhaps only by himself. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and in his gaze, she felt a strange and unsettling sense of being truly seen, not just as a woman, not just as a fugitive, but as something more, something he recognized. Slowly, he leaned forward. He reached out his hand, not quickly, but with a deliberate slowness that gave her every chance to pull away. His fingers were calloused and rough, the hand of a man who worked with wood and leather and earth. She flinched, an involuntary recoil born of bitter experience. But she didn't move away. His fingers gently closed around her hand, which was resting on her knee. His touch was not possessive, not demanding. It was firm, warm, and strangely steadying. He held her hand for a moment. Then, with that same deliberate slowness, he drew it toward him. He didn't pull her closer. He simply brought her hand to his own body, across the small space that separated them. He guided her palm until it lay flat against his chest, against the coarse fabric of his shirt. Beneath her hand, she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart. She could feel the warmth of his skin through the cloth, and she could feel something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a scar. But that word was too small, too simple for what lay beneath her palm. It wasn't a thin, clean line. It was a ruin, a deep, wide, knotted landscape of raised, ropey tissue. The shirt could not hide its terrible topography. It was an old wound, long since healed, but its memory was permanently etched into his flesh. It felt like a deep valley, a place where the body had been violently torn apart and had struggled to knit itself back together, leaving behind a permanent record of the damage. It was a wound that should have killed him. She stared at him, her eyes wide with 1,000 unspoken questions. Who had done this to him? Why? Wyatt's gaze never left hers. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a universe of pain. His own hand still rested over hers, pressing it gently against the scar, forcing her to feel the truth of his past. And then he spoke. His voice was a low, rough whisper, the words seeming to be pulled from a place of deep, old hurt. "I know," he said, the words barely disturbing the quiet air of the cave. "I know what it's like to have no one believe you." The words hung in the space between them, more revealing than a 1,000-page confession. He wasn't talking about her, he was talking about them. He had looked at her, broken and running, and had not seen a problem or an opportunity. He had seen a reflection. In that single, breathtaking moment, Claire understood. The men who hunted her called her a liar, a thief. They had twisted her story until she no longer recognized it herself, until she was the villain in a tale of their own making. She was a woman no one would believe, and this man, this silent, scarred man, knew that feeling in his bones, that terrible brand of loneliness, of being utterly and completely misunderstood by the world, was a country he had inhabited for a very long time. His kindness wasn't a transaction. It wasn't charity. It was an act of solidarity. He was protecting her because, in her, he was protecting a piece of his own shattered past. She didn't pull her hand away. She left it there, on his chest, her fingers spread across the deep, jagged ruin of his scar. She felt his heart beating, a steady, rhythmic drum beneath the memory of an old violence. And for the first time since she had started running, she felt the crushing weight of her own solitude begin to lift. She was not alone in this world after all. They returned to the homestead under the pale, unassuming light of the next afternoon. The journey back from the high rocks was a silent procession, but the quality of the silence had changed. Before, it had been a space defined by caution and the weight of unspoken questions. Now, it was a shared territory, a quiet understanding that had been forged in the crucible of fear and sealed by a single, whispered confession in a hidden cave. The cabin, when they reached it, was just as they had left it, still, stark and solitary. But to Claire, it looked different. The rough log walls seemed less like a fortress and more like a shelter. The thin curl of smoke from their banked fire, which she now rekindled, felt less like a signal of isolation and more like the steady breath of a sleeping home. The men on the ridge were gone, their threat having dissolved into the vast, empty plains. They had left behind a lingering echo of fear, but they had also left a gift. They had stripped away the last of Claire's pretenses and Wyatt's defenses, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their shared condition. A new rhythm began, as natural and unforced as the rising and setting of the sun. The wall of silence between them did not crumble, but its nature transformed. It became a comfortable quiet, a space where words were not necessary because a deeper communication was already taking place. They moved around each other with an unspoken grace, a choreography learned not through practice, but through a shared instinct for survival and a newfound respect for each other's solitude. When he went to the corral in the mornings, she would already have the fire going and coffee brewing, its rich, dark scent filling the small cabin. When she worked in the garden patch behind the house, she would find the water buckets had been filled and left where she could easily reach them. He never commented on the bread she learned to bake in the small, cast-iron stove. But when he came in from a long day of mending fences, he would eat 2 thick slices with a slow, deliberate satisfaction that was more eloquent than any compliment. She never asked about the long, lonely hours he spent oiling his rifle or staring out at the horizon, but she always made sure there was a hot plate of food waiting for him when his vigil was over. They were 2 solitary planets who had, by some strange celestial chance, been pulled into the same quiet orbit. They worked side by side, rarely speaking, yet always aware of the other's presence. When a fence post needed replacing, she would brace the heavy wood while he drove the nails. Their movements synchronized, their efforts combined toward a single, simple purpose to make this small, hard-scrabble piece of land a little more whole, a little more secure. The garden became Claire's domain, her personal treaty with the future. The patch of earth was rocky and stubborn, and for the first few days, her work was more excavation than cultivation. She dug out stones, some as small as her fist, others as large and heavy as a loaf of bread. She piled them into a neat wall along the edge of the plot, a monument to her own persistence. The work was hard, her muscles aching at the end of each day, her hands raw and calloused. But with every stone she removed, she felt as if she were clearing a piece of the stony, fallow ground within her own heart. She planted the seed potatoes Wyatt had left for her, placing each one in the dark, rich earth like a promise. She found a small packet of forgotten seeds in a tin on a high shelf in the cabin, beans and squash, and she planted them, too. She watered the plot with a religious devotion, carrying bucket after bucket from the creek. She was tending not just to a patch of dirt, but to the fragile, nascent seed of hope within herself. It was a defiant act. In a world that had tried to crush her, she was choosing to cultivate life. Wyatt never interfered, but he observed. Sometimes, as she worked under the hot afternoon sun, she would feel his eyes on her from the barn or the corral. His gaze was no longer the unreadable, assessing look of a stranger. It was quiet, steady, and held a new, unguarded softness. It was the look of a man watching something precious and unexpected take root in a place he had long since given up for barren. One afternoon, while searching for flat stones to create a small pathway through her garden, she wandered further into the rocky outcrop that sheltered the back of the cabin. It was a jumble of sun-bleached granite and dark, volcanic rock, a place where very little grew except for a few hardy, drought-resistant shrubs. And then she saw them. Tucked into a narrow crevice between two enormous boulders, where a pocket of soil had managed to collect, was a small, vibrant patch of yellow wildflowers. They weren't grand or delicate. They were tough, cheerful little things, their petals a brilliant, buttery yellow, their stems wiry and strong. They were thriving in the most impossible of places, a splash of brilliant, defiant color against the monochrome backdrop of the rock. They had asked for nothing, had been given no help, and yet here they were, drinking in the sun, their faces turned to the sky, a testament to the stubborn, unyielding nature of beauty. Claire knelt, a strange tightness in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time she had noticed something simply because it was beautiful. Her world had been one of sharp edges, of danger and shadows, of assessing everything and everyone for the threat they might pose. There had been no room for beauty, no time for the quiet contemplation of a simple flower. She reached out a hesitant finger and gently touched one of the petals. It was soft as velvet. A sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion washed over her gratitude, sorrow, and a fragile, unfamiliar feeling of joy, all mingled together. She felt a kinship with these small, tenacious flowers. They, too, were survivors. She didn't pick a bouquet. The thought of tearing them all from their tenacious hold seemed a violation. Instead, she chose a single, perfect stem, its bloom wide and bright. She carried it back to the cabin, holding it carefully in her hand, its brilliant yellow a stark contrast to her own dusty, work-worn fingers. What had possessed her to do it? She didn't know. It was an impulse, a feeling that this small piece of defiant beauty belonged not just to her, but to this place, to the quiet, wounded man who had given her sanctuary within it. She didn't hand it to him. That would have felt too bold, too loud. It would have required a response, and they were not people who dealt in the currency of easy words. Instead, she laid the single yellow wildflower on the flat stone that served as his doorstep. She placed it right in the center, a small, silent offering. And then she retreated to the barn, her heart beating with a strange, nervous flutter. Later, she saw him come in from the corral. He stopped at the cabin door, his tall frame pausing for a moment. She saw him look down. He stood there for a long time, his head bent, his expression hidden from her by the distance and the angle. Then, he bent down, picked up the flower, and went inside, closing the door softly behind him. He never mentioned it. The evening meal was the same quiet affair it always was. He ate his food, cleaned his plate, and settled by the fire to read from a worn, leather-bound book he sometimes took down from the high shelf. Claire felt a small, foolish pang of disappointment. Perhaps it had meant nothing to him. Perhaps it was just a weed, a bit of color that he had already discarded and forgotten. The next morning, she rose early to start the fire. Wyatt was still asleep, a rare occurrence. He lay on his narrow cot, one arm flung over his head, his face in repose, looking younger, more vulnerable. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the kindling box was empty. She remembered seeing a stash of dry pine splinters on the shelf above his bed. Tiptoeing across the floor, careful not to wake him, she reached up to the high shelf. As she did, her gaze fell upon the small, rickety table beside his bed. On it lay the book he had been reading last night. It was open, lying face down, as if he had been interrupted in his reading. Curiosity, a feeling she rarely indulged, got the better of her. She gently lifted the book to move it aside, and as she did, she saw it. There, pressed carefully between the pages of an old book of poems, was her wildflower. It was no longer a vibrant, living thing. Its stem was flat, its petals a delicate, paper-thin memory of their former brilliance. But it was there. He had not thrown it away. He had saved it. He had taken her small, silent offering of beauty and had preserved it, tucking it away within the pages of his own private world. A slow, warm smile spread across Claire's face, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She carefully placed the book back where she had found it, the pressed flower hidden safely within. He had said nothing, but his actions had spoken more eloquently than any words ever could. He had seen her offering, had understood its unspoken meaning, and had answered in the only way he knew how. He had taken the small piece of hope she had found among the rocks and had made it a part of his own story. The piece was a fragile, delicate thing, a tender green shoot in the hard-packed earth of their lives. In the weeks that followed their flight into the hills, a quiet domesticity had taken root at the homestead. The fear, which had been a constant, bitter taste in Claire's mouth, had receded, replaced by the savory scent of baking bread and the clean, earthy smell of her burgeoning garden. The green shoots of beans and squash were pushing their way toward the sun with a stubborn, miraculous persistence. The world had become small, contained within the protective embrace of the hills, and for the first time, that smallness felt not like a prison, but like a sanctuary. The rhythm of their days was a silent, synchronized dance. She would work the garden while he mended the harness. He would chop wood while she ground the coffee beans. They were two halves of a single, functioning whole. Their shared purpose, the simple, profound act of living another day in this quiet place. The memory of the men on the ridge had begun to feel like a bad dream, a fever that had broken, leaving behind only a faint, lingering chill. They had been fooled. They had moved on. The danger had passed. It was this belief, this slow-growing and treacherous sense of safety, that led her to the creek that afternoon. The sun was warm on her back, and a light breeze whispered through the willows that lined the bank. She was humming, a tuneless, half-forgotten melody from a life she could barely remember. The water barrels were full, but she had come to gather smooth, flat stones for the hearth, a small, unnecessary task that was more about creating a sense of home than it was about any real need. She set the empty bucket down and knelt by the water's edge, her reflection a wavering, indistinct shape in the clear, moving current. She was so absorbed in her task, in the simple, tactile pleasure of searching for the perfect stone, that she didn't hear them. She didn't hear the soft thud of hoofbeats on the dusty trail. She didn't hear the creak of saddle leather. The first sign was a shadow that fell over her, sudden and cold, eclipsing the warmth of the sun. The second was a voice, a low, gravelly drawl that lanced through the peaceful afternoon and straight into her heart, turning her blood to ice. Well, now, look what the creek washed up. Claire froze, her hand hovering over a smooth gray stone. Her entire body went rigid. It couldn't be. It was a nightmare. She was dreaming, but the shadow was real. And the voice was a sound she had prayed every single night she would never hear again. Slowly, she lifted her head. He sat on his horse just a few feet away. A large, heavy-set man with a dirty beard and small, piggish eyes that glittered with a triumphant, malicious glee. Silas. Behind him, two other men, their faces hard and familiar, reined in their horses, their expressions a mixture of smug satisfaction and trail-weary boredom. They were the same three men, but they hadn't been fooled. They had been patient. "You made us ride a long way, girl," Silas said, swinging a heavy leg over his saddle and dismounting. He landed with a thud, the gun belt around his thick waist sagging under the weight of a large pistol. "A real long way. Wasted a whole day chasing your little ghost fire up in the hills." Claire couldn't breathe. The air had been sucked from her lungs. The peaceful sounds of the creek, the burble of the water, the buzz of a dragonfly faded into a roaring silence in her ears. All the progress she had made, all the fragile peace she had cultivated, shattered into a million pieces. The weak, terrified girl she had been was back, and she was a prisoner in her own skin. "Get up," Silas snarled, his good humor evaporating. She didn't move. Her limbs were made of lead. Her mind was a white, buzzing void of pure terror. With a curse, he reached down and grabbed her arm, his thick fingers digging into her flesh like talons. He hauled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. The world spun, and she stumbled, her knees weak. "Seems you found yourself a little home," he said, his eyes scanning the homestead in the distance, the neat cabin, the plume of smoke from the chimney, the sturdy corral. "Well, real cozy, but playtime's over. You're coming back with us. The boss wants a word." At the corral, Wyatt was replacing a rotted post. The work was hard, his focus absolute. But he was a man who lived by his senses, who was attuned to the subtle shifts and sounds of his environment. He heard it. Not the voices, they were too far away, but the sudden, sharp clatter of a metal bucket falling against stones. It was a discordant note in the afternoon symphony, a sound of alarm. His head snapped up, his eyes instantly scanning the line of willows by the creek. He saw her. He saw the three horses. He saw the dark, hulking shape of the man holding her arm. For a single, heartbeat-long moment, Wyatt went utterly still. The hammer he was holding dropped from his hand, landing silently in the soft dust. The quiet homesteader, the sad, solitary man, vanished. In his place was something cold, ancient, and lethal. His face became a mask of stone, and his eyes, which had so recently held a soft, watchful light, became as hard and dark as chips of obsidian. He didn't run toward the cabin for his rifle. There wasn't time. They had her. He moved with a terrifying, explosive speed, vaulting over the corral fence. His roan, sensing the sudden, violent shift in its master, snorted and shied away. Wyatt didn't soothe it. He grabbed the reins, swung himself into the saddle in a single, fluid motion, and dug his heels into the horse's flanks. The roan leaped forward, not into a canter, but into a dead, frantic gallop. It was a charge, a desperate, ground-eating explosion of muscle and speed. Down by the creek, Silas heard the thunder of hooves and turned, a look of annoyance on his face. "What in the hell?" He saw the lone rider bearing down on them, a whirlwind of dust and fury. For a moment, he was taken aback by the sheer, suicidal audacity of it. "1 man against 3. He let out a harsh laugh. "Well, it seems your new friend wants to be a hero." He sneered at Claire, shoving her behind him. To his men, he barked, "Draw!" Leather slapped against holsters as the other 2 men pulled their pistols. Wyatt didn't slow. He rode straight at them. A man possessed. The world had narrowed to the woman, the man holding her, and the space between them. The first shot cracked the air. wild and high. The second kicked up dust a few feet from the roan's pounding hooves. Wyatt was a harder target than they had anticipated, a blur of motion. Just as he was about to crash into them, he reined the horse in hard. The roan, a magnificent animal trained for battle, slid to a halt on its haunches, its body a living shield between Wyatt and the two gunmen. In the same motion, Wyatt swung his leg over the saddle, his rifle, which had been resting in its scabbard, now in his hand. "Let her go, Silas." Wyatt's voice was unnaturally calm, a flat, cold sound that cut through the tension. Silas laughed again, a wheezing, ugly sound. He kept Claire in front of him, one beefy arm wrapped around her throat, the barrel of his pistol pressed against her temple. "You're in no position to be making demands. Friend, you're outnumbered. Now, you drop that rifle, or the girl gets a third eye." The standoff was absolute. The air crackled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. Wyatt stood half-sheltered by his horse, his rifle held at the ready. The two other men had their pistols trained on him, their knuckles white. Claire could barely breathe. The rough fabric of Silas's sleeve was chafing her neck, and the cold ring of the gun barrel against her skin was a terrifying promise of death. But through her fear, she watched Wyatt. He wasn't looking at the other gunmen. His eyes were locked on Silas, a gaze so intense, so filled with a cold, murderous rage, that it made her shiver. Then everything happened at once. Wyatt made a sound, a low, guttural cry, and lunged forward. Not at Silas, but at the man closest to him. He didn't fire his rifle, he used it as a club, swinging the heavy stock in a brutal arc that connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The man went down without a sound. The second gunman, startled, fired. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Wyatt's shoulder. A fiery, searing pain. Wyatt grunted but didn't falter. He spun, bringing the rifle around, and fired from the hip. The shot was a deafening roar. The second gunman clutched his chest, his eyes wide with surprise, and toppled backward into the shallow water of the creek. It was a beautiful, terrible, and brutally efficient display, but it had taken too long. Silas saw his chance. With Wyatt's attention diverted, he shoved Claire to the ground and raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Wyatt's back. Claire hit the dirt hard. The air knocked out of her. She looked up, her vision swimming, and saw it all in a horrifying, slow-motion tableau. Wyatt, turning, his face a mask of pain. Silas, his face twisted in a triumphant snarl, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that instant, something inside Claire snapped. The terror that had paralyzed her, the weakness that had defined her, was burned away by a sudden, white-hot surge of pure, protective fury. This man, this quiet, scarred man who had shown her nothing but kindness, was about to die for her, and she would not let it happen. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she lunged for Wyatt's horse. The roan, terrified by the gunfire, was rearing and stamping, its eyes wide with panic. On the saddle, still in its leather scabbard, was the rifle Wyatt had used. Her hands, clumsy with desperation, fumbled with the strap. She tore the heavy weapon free. She had fired a gun only a few times in her life, and never in anger. But now, it felt like an extension of her own will. She raised it to her shoulder, the stock clumsy and heavy against her small frame. She didn't have time to aim properly. She just pointed the long barrel at the center of Silas's broad back, closed her eyes, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was a physical blow, a brutal punch that slammed into her shoulder and knocked her backward. The roar of the shot was deafening, a sound that seemed to tear the world in two. When she opened her eyes, the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Her ears were ringing. Silas was no longer standing. He was on his knees, his pistol lying in the dust beside him. He looked down at the crimson stain blossoming on the front of his shirt with a look of profound, bewildered surprise. Then, without a sound, he pitched forward onto his face and lay still. A profound, echoing silence fell over the creek bed, broken only by the panicked breathing of the horse and the soft gurgle of the water. Claire stared, the heavy rifle slipping from her nerveless fingers and clattering onto the stones. Her entire body was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She looked at her hands. They were trembling, covered in dirt. But they had just held a rifle. They had just taken a life to save another. Wyatt stumbled toward her, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His face was pale, his breathing ragged, but he was alive. He ignored the bodies, ignored the blood, and knelt beside her. "Claire," he said, his voice rough with pain and something else awe. He reached out, not to comfort her, but to simply lay his hand on her arm, a grounding touch in the middle of the carnage. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and full of a terrible, newfound knowledge. Then she looked back at the still form of Silas, at the quiet creek, at her own trembling hands. The fear was still there, a cold sickness in the pit of her stomach. But for the first time, it was not the only thing she felt. Beneath the terror, beneath the shock, a new feeling was taking root, a hard, unyielding core of strength. She was not the same woman who had crumpled in a dry creek bed. She was not the same woman who had frozen in terror just moments ago. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who had stared into the face of her own destruction and had chosen to fight back. She was shaking, yes, but she was no longer weak. The world dissolved into a cacophony of ringing silence. The thunder of the final gunshot echoed and died, leaving behind a vacuum that was more deafening than the noise itself. For a long, suspended moment, Claire remained on the ground, the hard, unforgiving stones pressing into her knees, her mind a blank slate, wiped clean by the violence of the last few minutes. Then, the world rushed back in, a brutal, overwhelming torrent. The metallic, coppery scent of blood, the acrid tang of gunpowder hanging heavy and still in the air, the soft, insistent gurgling of the creek, utterly indifferent to the human carnage on its banks, and Wyatt's voice, cutting through the haze, pulling her back to the horrifying present. His hand on her arm was a point of heat, an anchor in the swirling chaos of her senses. She looked up at him, and the blankness in her own eyes was met with a raw, agonizing pain in his. He was pale, a ghostly white beneath his sun-darkened skin, and a steady, dark stream of red was seeping from his shoulder, staining his shirt a terrible, blossoming crimson. "We have to go," he gritted out, his voice strained, each word an obvious effort. "Now, before someone comes to investigate the shots." The words broke her paralysis. He was hurt, badly. The realization was a jolt of ice water, clearing the fog from her mind. The shaking in her limbs didn't stop, but now it was fueled by a new, frantic urgency. She had saved him, but the battle wasn't over. Now, she had to keep him alive. "Can you walk?" she asked, her own voice sounding thin and reedy to her ears. He gave a curt, pained nod. "Help me up." Somehow, she found the strength. She got to her feet, her legs unsteady, and braced herself as he leaned his weight on her. He was heavier than he looked, a dead, solid weight of muscle and bone. A low groan of pure agony escaped his lips as he put pressure on his wounded side. Her own small frame buckled, but she held firm, her jaw set, her entire being focused on this one, singular task. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, stumbling nightmare. Every step was an eternity. Wyatt leaned heavily on her, his breathing growing more shallow and ragged with each yard they covered. Claire's world narrowed to the feel of his weight against her, the sight of the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, and the sound of his pained, hitching breaths. She didn't look back at the still, silent forms by the creek. To look back was to let the horror in, and she couldn't afford that right now. She had to be strong. For him. They finally reached the cabin, a journey of a few hundred yards that had felt like 1,000 miles. She half dragged, half carried him through the door, and he collapsed onto his narrow cot, the wooden frame groaning in protest. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes were glassy with pain and shock, and a feverish sheen of sweat covered his forehead. For a moment, panic, cold and absolute, threatened to overwhelm her. What was she to do? She was no doctor. She knew nothing of gunshot wounds, of saving a man's life. She looked at his pale, still face, at the blood that was now soaking into the rough blanket of his bed, and a wave of utter helplessness washed over her. Then, she looked at her own hands. They were still trembling, but they were the same hands that had lifted a rifle, that had pulled a trigger. They were capable. She would make them be. A strange, cold calm settled over her. She moved with a purpose she didn't know she possessed. First, fire. The embers were still glowing. She added wood until a strong, steady blaze was roaring in the hearth, chasing the growing shadows from the corners of the small room. Then, water. She grabbed a bucket and ran to the creek, her earlier terror replaced by a grim determination. She didn't look at the bodies. She averted her eyes, filled the bucket with clean, cold water, and ran back. She put a pot of water on to boil. Then she turned to him. His shirt was a ruin, soaked and sticky with blood. It had to come off. She found a small, sharp knife he used for skinning game and, with a deep, steadying breath, she began to cut the fabric away from the wound. Her hands were surprisingly steady. The wound was ugly. It was a deep, ragged tear in the muscle of his shoulder, oozing dark, venous blood. The bullet had gone clean through, which she dimly knew was a good thing, but the damage it had left in its wake was terrifying. She took the pot of boiling water and poured some into a basin, letting it cool slightly. She found a small flask of whiskey on his shelf. She knew what it was for. Tearing strips from one of her few clean chemises, she soaked a cloth in the hot water and began to clean the wound, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He flinched, a hiss of pain escaping his clenched teeth, but he didn't cry out. When the wound was as clean as she could get it, she took the whiskey flask. She looked at him, her eyes asking a silent question. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She poured the raw, burning liquid directly into the wound. His reaction was violent. His entire body went rigid, his back arching off the cot. A strangled, animal sound of pure agony torn from his throat. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled down his temples. But it was a cleansing fire. She used the strips of her chemise to bind the wound, her movements clumsy but firm, creating a thick, absorbent bandage to staunch the bleeding. When she was done, he had lapsed into a feverish, semi-conscious state. His breathing was shallow, his skin hot and dry to the touch. The long night had begun. Claire pulled one of the rough stools close to his bed and sat down. There was nothing more she could do but wait, and watch, and pray. The cabin was a small, isolated world, lit only by the flickering, dancing light of the fire. Outside, the sun set, and a deep, star-dusted darkness fell over the land. The wind rose, a low, mournful sigh that whispered around the corners of the cabin and rattled the single glass pane in the small window. Claire did not move. Her entire universe had shrunk to the space of this small, warm room, to the figure of the man lying so unnaturally still on the cot. She watched the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest, each breath a small miracle, a tiny victory against the encroaching darkness. That steady, rhythmic sound was the only thing that kept the terror at bay. It was the sound of hope. As the hours crept by, as the moon traced its slow, silver path across the night sky, the silence began to work on her. The adrenaline from the fight had long since faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the terrible, echoing memory of what she had done. The image of Silas falling, the surprised look on his face, the heavy, final thud of his body hitting the earth, it played over and over again in her mind. And in the deep, profound quiet of the night, surrounded by the sleeping world, she began to talk. Her voice was a whisper at first, a fragile thread of sound woven into the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. She wasn't sure if he could hear her. It didn't matter. She was speaking not for him, but for herself, unburdening a story that had been locked away in her heart for so long it had begun to poison her. She told him everything. She told him about her father, a good, gentle man who had owned a small, prosperous ranch in a valley 200 miles to the east. She told him about the land, rich with water, a prize coveted by a powerful, ruthless man named Henderson, the boss Silas had spoken of. She spoke of her father's refusal to sell, of the threats that had followed, subtle at first, then more open. Her words tumbled out, hesitant and broken, into the warm, fire-lit darkness. She told him of the day her father had been found at the bottom of a ravine, his horse supposedly having thrown him. But she had seen the fear in her father's eyes in the weeks before, had heard the late-night arguments with Henderson's men. She knew it wasn't an accident. She told Wyatt how she, young and foolish and fueled by a righteous grief, had gone to the town sheriff, had accused Henderson of murder. She described the sheriff's dismissive smile, the way the whole town had looked at her as if she were crazy. Henderson owned the town, the sheriff, everything. A girl's word against his was less than nothing. Her voice grew stronger as the memories poured out. She told him how, a week later, the sheriff had come to her ranch with a warrant. A large sum of money had gone missing from Henderson's office, and a witness, one of Henderson's own cronies, had sworn he'd seen her climbing out the window. She was a liar, a hysteric, and now she was a thief. It was a neat, tidy story that discredited her accusations and gave Henderson a legal claim to her land. She spoke of her flight, of slipping away in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a pair of her father's old, oversized shoes. She had been running ever since, from the law, from Henderson's men, from the ghost of a life that had been stolen from her. She talked until her throat was raw, until the moon had vanished from the window and the first faint, gray hint of dawn began to soften the edges of the eastern sky. She had emptied herself of all the poison, all the fear and injustice. She had laid her story, her truth, at the feet of this unconscious man. Exhausted, she fell silent. She leaned her head against the rough wood of the bed frame, her eyes heavy. The fire had burned down to a bed of soft, glowing embers. Wyatt's breathing was still shallow, but it seemed steadier now, deeper. The fever in his skin seemed to have cooled. She must have dozed off, her head slumped forward, lulled into a shallow, dreamless sleep by the sheer weight of her exhaustion. She didn't know how much time had passed, minutes or an hour, when a sound, a small, rough whisper, pulled her back. "Claire!" Her head snapped up. Her heart leaped into her throat. Wyatt's eyes were open. They were no longer glassy, but clear, lucid, and fixed on her face. The terrible pallor was gone, replaced by the waxy exhaustion of a man who had been to the edge of death and back. He looked at her tear-stained, soot-smudged face, at her slumped, weary posture. He looked at the stool pulled close to his bed, at the basin of bloody water, at the strips of her own clothing that now bound his wound. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the very first time. His lips parted, and he spoke again, his voice a dry, hoarse rasp. But it was his voice. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask about his wound. He asked the only question that mattered, a question that came from a place far deeper than the physical pain in his shoulder. "You're still here?" The question was a quiet devastation, revealing the raw, desolate landscape of his own past, his own expectations of abandonment. He had expected her to run, to leave him to his fate. Claire looked at him, at this man who had seen her at her absolute worst and had offered nothing but a quiet, unwavering belief. She thought of the long, lonely road behind her, a road of fear and flight, and she thought of this small, quiet cabin, of the garden she had planted, of the feeling of his heart beating beneath her hand. She reached out and laid her hand on his, her touch gentle but firm. A slow, tired smile touched her lips. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice soft, but filled with a new and unbreakable certainty. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. She had stopped running. She was home. The long night gave way to a series of quiet, sun-drenched days. Wyatt's recovery was slow, a gradual ascent from the deep, dark valley of his injury. The fever broke, leaving him weak and spent, but alive. In the days that followed, the roles they had first established were completely inverted. He, who had been the silent, unshakable pillar of strength, was now confined to his cot, his powerful body rendered frustratingly useless, and Claire, who had arrived as a broken, fleeing refugee, became his unwavering caretaker. Their world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, but within that small space, a new and profound intimacy grew. It was an intimacy born not of romantic whispers, but of shared, practical necessity. She learned the geography of his pain from the slightest tightening of his jaw as she changed his bandages. He learned the rhythm of her movements, the soft tread of her boots on the floorboards, the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl as she brought him the thin, savory broth she made from one of their few chickens. Words were still a scarce commodity between them, but they were no longer needed. Her touch, as she cleaned his wound, was a language all its own, steady, gentle, and unapologetically present. His eyes, as they followed her moving through the cabin, held a look of raw, unguarded gratitude that was more potent than any spoken poetry. He had saved her life with a canteen of water. She was now saving his, one bowl of soup, one clean bandage at a time. As his strength began to return, so too did the life of the homestead. The first time he was able to sit up on his own, he did so on the porch, watching with a quiet intensity as Claire methodically weeded her garden. The beanstalks were now climbing their rough-hewn poles, and the squash vines were spreading, their broad green leaves a testament to her patient labor. He saw the way she moved, the new, confident set of her shoulders, the capable way she handled the tools. The wild, haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a clear, steady calm. The day he was finally strong enough to walk to the corral under his own power was a quiet turning point. The physical world, which had been held at bay by his injury, now demanded their attention. The brutal confrontation by the creek had been a violent interruption of their lives, and the evidence of that interruption was all around them. A section of the fence he had been mending was still unfinished. The barn door hung slightly askew from a panicked horse kicking it during the firefight. The homestead, their sanctuary, felt wounded, just as he had been. And so, together, they began to heal it. The work was their new conversation. They started with the fence line. Wyatt, his left arm still in a sling, could only do so much. He showed her how to brace the posts, how to use the post hole digger. His instructions delivered in a few quiet, practical words. Most of the time, he simply demonstrated, his movements slow and deliberate, and she would watch, learn, and then replicate his actions with a fierce, focused determination. She supplied the strength his body still lacked, her muscles, hardened by weeks of gardening and carrying water, proving surprisingly capable. They worked in a comfortable, synchronized rhythm, the sound of the hammer, the scrape of the shovel, the soft thud of earth filling the companionable silence. They were not just mending a fence, they were rebuilding the boundaries of their world, making it whole and secure once more. Next was the barn. He taught her how to mix a patch of daub from mud and straw to chink the gaps in the cabin walls, preparing for the inevitable chill of autumn. She, in turn, discovered a small leak in the barn roof and, under his watchful eye, learned to climb the ladder and carefully nail a new cedar shake into place. Each repaired fixture, each completed task, was a small victory, a tangible piece of their shared life they had reclaimed from the chaos. The roan horse, whose name she learned was simply Roan, became her next tutor. Wyatt was still unable to ride, and the horse needed exercise. He stood on the porch, his voice a low, calm murmur, and guided her through the steps of saddling the magnificent animal. At first, she was intimidated by its size and power, her movements hesitant and clumsy, but Wyatt was a patient teacher, and the horse, sensing her gentle intentions, was a forgiving one. She learned the specific heft and smell of the saddle blanket, the intricate puzzle of the straps and buckles. She learned to speak to the horse in a low, soothing tone, the same way Wyatt did. He showed her how to lift a hoof to check for stones, her hand surprisingly steady as she held the heavy, iron-shod foot. One sun-drenched afternoon, she led Roan on a long, slow walk around the perimeter of the homestead, the reins held loosely but confidently in her hand. Wyatt watched from the porch, and the quiet, almost imperceptible nod he gave her upon her return filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. She was no longer just a guest here, a recipient of his charity. She was a partner. She was earning her place. The evenings took on a new, softer rhythm. After the hard work of the day, they would sit by the fire. He would read from his worn book of poems, the quiet cadence of his voice a comforting presence in the room, though he never read aloud. Claire, having discovered a small sewing kit in an old wooden chest, took to mending their clothes. The needle, a small sliver of silver, became a familiar tool in her hand. She patched the tear in his good shirt, her stitches small and neat. She darned their socks, her fingers moving with a practiced, methodical grace. She took to doing her sewing on the porch as the sun went down, enjoying the cool evening breeze and the spectacular display of colors as the sky bled from orange and pink to a deep, velvety purple. She would sit on the top step, her back against a post, her work lit by the last vestiges of daylight. It was during these quiet evenings that Wyatt began a project of his own. After their meal, he would disappear into the barn for an hour or two. She could hear the soft, rhythmic sounds from within the rasp of a hand plane against wood, the gentle tap-tap-tap of a mallet. She never asked what he was doing. Their life was built on the mutual respect of these private, unspoken territories. His time in the barn was his own, just as her time in the garden was hers. One evening, Claire came out to the porch after washing the dinner plates and stopped. Her usual spot on the top step was occupied. Sitting there, solid and unassuming in the twilight, was a chair. It was a simple thing, with no fancy carving or ornamentation. It was made from leftover pieces of pine and cedar, the different woods giving it a slightly mismatched, homespun character. But it was beautifully made. The four legs were sturdy and even. The back was canted at a comfortable angle. She ran her hand over the armrest. The wood had been sanded to a perfectly smooth, silken finish, with no danger of a stray splinter. It was a chair built by a man who paid attention. He had seen her sitting uncomfortably on the step night after night. He had noted the way she had to hunch over her sewing, and without a word, without any fuss or presentation, he had taken it upon himself to make her a place of comfort. He had built her a seat from which to watch the sunset. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes. She sat down in the chair. It was the perfect height. It felt as if it had been made just for her, and she knew, with a sudden, overwhelming certainty, that it had been. From this new vantage point, she could see into the barn, where Wyatt was now cleaning an oil lamp, his back to her, pretending not to notice. This was how they spoke to each other, not with promises or declarations, but with a mended fence, a newly shod horse, a patch of thriving beans, and a simple, hand-carved chair. Claire thought about the words people used in the world she had left behind, words like husband and wife, sweetheart and lover. They felt foreign here, like ill-fitting clothes from a different life. Those words were built on promises, on vows of a future that was never guaranteed, and promises, as she knew all too well, could be broken. What she and Wyatt had was something different. It was quieter, but it was also stronger. It wasn't built on the uncertain promise of tomorrow, but on the solid, tangible reality of today. It was in the bread she baked for him. It was in the chair he built for her. It was in the shared silence of two wounded people who had, against all odds, found a way to build a life not next to each other, but with each other. They had no name for what they were, no vows to bind them. They had only the steady, unspoken truth of their actions. And in this quiet, forgotten corner of the world, that was more than enough. The season turned. Autumn arrived not as a guest, but as a quiet resident, settling into the valley with a gentle, weary sigh. The relentless, hammering heat of summer softened into a golden, benevolent warmth. The leaves on the willows by the creek turned a brittle, buttery yellow, and the sparse grass on the hillsides was cured to the color of old honey. The air grew crisp in the mornings, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the distant, smoky promise of winter. For Claire and Wyatt, it was a season of quiet harvest. Her garden had, against all odds, produced a modest but precious bounty. The squash were firm and dark green, the beans plentiful. They spent their days working side by side, preparing for the coming cold. They dug up the last of the potatoes, their hands moving in a comfortable, practiced rhythm as they sorted the vegetables for storage in the small, cool root cellar Wyatt had shown her how to clean and reinforce. Life had settled into a routine that was as steady and predictable as the turning of the earth. It was a life measured not in hours, but in tasks. The morning was for milking the cow and feeding the chickens. The afternoon was for chopping wood, mending tack, or reinforcing the cabin against the wind. The evening was for the simple, shared ritual of a meal eaten by the fire, followed by the quiet companionship of her mending and his reading. The terrible violence by the creek had become a ghost, a dark memory that had been buried under the weight of these simple, life-affirming days. They never spoke of it. They never spoke of the men who now lay in 3 unmarked graves in a rocky patch of land far from the homestead. A grim task they had undertaken together in a somber, wordless partnership. The past was a locked room, and they had both, by silent, mutual consent, agreed to leave the door closed. But for Claire, the peace was a double-edged sword. As the homestead healed, as Wyatt's shoulder mended into a puckered, angry scar that mirrored the older one on his chest, as their winter stores grew, a slow, creeping unease began to take root in her heart. She would watch him sometimes. When he didn't know she was looking, she would see the way he moved, the quiet confidence that had returned to him, the way his eyes would sometimes soften as he watched the sunset from the porch. She saw that he was beginning to let down his guard, to inhabit this small space, not as a hunted man in a hideout, but as a man in his home. And she knew, with a certainty that was a cold, hard stone in her gut, that she was the single greatest threat to it all. The danger had not come for him. It had followed her. The shadow that had fallen over this valley was her own. She had brought the violence, the bloodshed, the ghosts. He had been safe here in his solitude, protected by his isolation. She had breached his defenses, and in doing so, had almost gotten him killed. The guilt was a patient predator, stalking her in the quiet moments. It was there when she handed him a plate of food, a bitter aftertaste to the simple meal. It was there when she sat in the chair he had built for her, the smooth, sanded wood, a constant, painful reminder of his quiet kindness, a kindness she felt she had repaid with nothing but peril. She loved this life. She loved the clean scent of the air, the solid feel of the earth beneath her feet, the profound, healing silence of this place. More than that, she had come to care for the silent, wounded man who shared it with her. But that was precisely why she knew she couldn't stay. To stay was an act of profound selfishness. To stay was to wait for the other boot to drop, for Henderson to send more men, for the fragile peace they had built to be shattered once and for all. The truest, most difficult act of love, she realized, was to leave, to give him back the one thing she had taken from him, his safety. The decision once made, settled in her with a heavy, final resignation. She spent the next few days in a state of quiet mourning, memorizing the small details of the life she was about to give up, the specific pattern of the grain on the wooden table, the way the morning light slanted through the single window, the low, rumbling sound of Wyatt's voice as he spoke to Roan. She hoarded these small, precious moments like a miser hoarding gold, storing them away for the long, lonely winter of the soul that she knew was coming. She chose a day when he was planning to ride the fence line at the far western edge of his property, a task that would take him from sunup to sundown. The night before, she lay awake on her small pallet by the fire, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing from the cot across the room. It was the sound that had anchored her through that first, terrible night of his injury. Now, it was a sound she was choosing to walk away from. In the pre-dawn gray, she moved like a ghost. She packed a small, pathetic bundle, a spare chemise, the last of the bread she had baked, a small canteen of water. She left the boots. They were his. They belonged to this place. She put on the old, ill-fitting men's shoes she had arrived in, a painful but necessary penance. She was returning to the woman she had been, a fugitive with nothing but the clothes on her back. She took one last look around the cabin, her heart a tight, aching fist in her chest. The room was filled with his presence, with the quiet, invisible threads of the life they had woven together. She looked at the chair on the porch, a dark, solid shape in the gloom. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She brushed it away angrily. This was not a moment for weakness. She opened the door, the familiar creak of the leather hinges sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. She slipped outside into the cold, damp air. The sky was just beginning to pale in the east, the stars fading. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped off the porch. "Claire." His voice came from the darkness beside the barn. It was not a question. It was a statement, a quiet, unmovable fact. She froze, her back to him, her hand clutching her small bundle. He was supposed to be asleep. He was supposed to be gone. A wave of despair and, strangely, relief washed over her. She had failed, and she was so terribly glad that she had. Slowly, she turned. He was standing there, leaning against the corral fence, a silhouette against the coming dawn. He was fully dressed. He had not been asleep. He had been waiting. "You weren't just going for an early walk," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a simple observation, delivered in his usual low, quiet tone. She couldn't speak, the words she had rehearsed, the careful, logical explanation of why she had to leave. All of it turned to ash in her mouth. All she could do was stand there, caught, her pathetic bundle a clear confession of her intent. He pushed himself off the fence and walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate on the damp earth. He stopped a few feet in front of her. His eyes, in the pale, uncertain light, were dark and deep, and they held a familiar, aching sorrow, but also something else, a flicker of a question, a quiet plea. "You're bringing trouble to this place," she finally managed to whisper, her voice thick with unshed tears. "To you. The men, they came for me. More will come. I can't. I won't let them destroy this. Let them destroy you." He just looked at her, his expression unchanging. "This place was half dead before you came," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was just passing the time." "You were safe," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "You were safe, and I took that away." He took another step closer. So close now she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool morning air. "It wasn't safety," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It was just a quieter kind of grave." She shook her head, a violent, helpless gesture. She didn't understand. She was offering him his life back, and he was refusing to take it. The old, familiar question. The question that had defined their entire relationship rose to her lips, but this time it was different. It was not born of fear or confusion. It was a raw, naked plea, the last, most honest question in her heart. "So what do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Wyatt looked at her for a long, silent moment. The first rays of the sun broke over the eastern ridge, spilling golden light across the valley, illuminating the tear tracks on her cheeks and the profound, unwavering certainty in his eyes. He didn't pull her into his arms. He didn't offer a grand declaration. He just gave her the simplest, most profound truth he possessed. Stay. The word was a quiet thunderclap. It was not a request. It was an answer. It was the end of a long, lonely road. It was a foundation stone, laid down in the center of their broken world. It was everything. The strength went out of her legs. The small bundle she was carrying slipped from her nerveless fingers and fell to the ground with a soft thud. She took a stumbling step forward, not into his arms, but into his space, into the quiet, solid certainty of his presence. She laid her head against his chest, her forehead pressing against the rough, warm fabric of his shirt, beneath her cheek. She could feel it, the deep, jagged landscape of his old scar. She could feel the steady, powerful, rhythmic beat of his heart. It was the sound of a life that had been broken and had mended. It was the sound of a man who had stopped running. It was the sound of home. She didn't say yes, she didn't have to. She just closed her eyes, leaned her weight against him, and for the first time felt the profound, unshakable peace of a soul that had finally stopped running. He slowly raised his arms, not to hold her tightly, but to simply rest them on her back, a gesture of quiet, unconditional acceptance. They stood there as the sun rose higher, two solitary figures casting a single, long shadow across the land, no longer defined by the ghosts they were running from, but by the quiet, solid ground on which they had chosen to stay. Thank you for listening to our story. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like the video, and give it some extra support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.